The candidates for House District 13B are still with us here in the studio. We have the DFLer, Heidi Everett, here. Heidi, good afternoon once again.
Hello.
And we also have the Republican incumbent, Tim O'Driscoll, with us as well. Tim, thanks for sticking around.
Greetings and thank you.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about, we got to know you both a little bit better in the first half hour. Here in the second half hour, let's talk a little bit about some of the issues. We'll start with you this time, Heidi. What is your number one issue? If you get elected and you go to St. Paul for the next legislative session, what's one issue you really want to tackle and take on right away?
The issue that I hear most about from voters when I'm out knocking doors is health care. And I know this is actually something that both Tim and I feel is important to address for the state of Minnesota, but I believe our approaches for tackling it are different. Certainly, I am a strong advocate for the single-payer healthcare system, and I believe as the Affordable Care Act is eroded at the national level, we in Minnesota need to step up and say that the care of our citizens is a top priority for us, because if we have healthy citizens, we have a strong, healthy, vibrant economy and state. I know one of the things Tim will probably tout is the legislation that was passed to cap that double-digit growth in premiums. And I do think that was an important piece of legislation. But one of the things that I would like to add is that a lot of the health insurance coverage packages right now are really a scam. I met one couple out on the campaign trail that they pay $18,000 a year out of pocket, and every family member has a $6,000 deductible before any health insurance kicks in. That's not health insurance, that's counterfeit coverage. And so capping the cost on a scam is still forcing our citizens to pay for a scam. And I do think we need to step up and say, you know what, single-payer health care is the answer for Minnesota so that every Minnesotan has coverage and access to quality care.
Tim, I know that you said in the first segment, too, that you wanted to get to the issue of healthcare, and I know talk a little bit about what your plan is.
Sure. Heidi's exactly right. We have different views and different opinions on how we're going to get there. The thing that I think is really important for us to keep in mind is that neither Heidi nor myself started the program down the road that we are on, and we are going to be asked to solve and to resolve those issues. And in 2013, when the DFL had complete government control, they put into place the MNsure program, and we've wasted an awful lot of money just on the technology and trying to get that system to be able to work right. Wouldn't it be nice if we could have used that money to help reduce premiums and to build a better system in the state of Minnesota that actually delivered healthcare and delivered reimbursement for individuals and their health needs in the state of Minnesota. In 2018, when the legislature passed the reinsurance program in the state of Minnesota and the premium credit program for individuals who were looking at astronomical premiums, the Dayton administration's Department of Commerce came to the legislature and said, if you don't do this, we're looking at double-digit increases in 2018. And we were able to get that through. The governor didn't sign it, but he said he wasn't going to veto it and he was going to let it come into law. So Republicans own all the fixes that have happened in the legislature right now, solely because the governor stepped back on it. One of the things that we had in the state of Minnesota prior to the Affordable Care Act was a program called MCHA, the Minnesota Comprehensive Health Insurance Association. And early on in the Bill Clinton administration, a name that people will recognize very readily, the First Lady, Hillary Clinton, spent an awful lot of time in the first 90 days of the Clinton administration in Minnesota looking at what we do here in Minnesota. And we've asked the Dayton administration a number of times if they would be open to a waiver, are going and asking the federal government for a waiver from some or parts of the Affordable Care Act. And to date, the administration has not been embracing of that idea. New opportunity for the state of Minnesota, going to have a new governor. Don't know who it's going to be, but hopefully that governor will be a little bit more open to wanting to help us with Minnesota's healthcare related issues by asking for that waiver. Well, what that would allow us to do is to be able to revert back to a program, or at least put that option back on the table of MCHA. What did it do? It said if you've been rejected by an insurance company or you were a high-risk individual, we put you into a high-risk pool. And then what we did is we charged all insurance insurance carriers a certain sum of money to help offset those higher costs, thus keeping the cost down for the average consumer, as well as isolating and taking care of those individuals that have needs. Another thing that we could do is offer a tax credit or a tax deduction here in the state of Minnesota for insurance premiums. We don't have to wait for the federal government to start offering something in that nature. Minnesota has that, at least on the state return, within its control. I'm very concerned about moving from something that isn't working to something else that we don't know. I'd like to go back and take the components of what was working and what's working right now, because last time I checked, people are very concerned about their health and want to have predictability and dependability and reliability on delivery of services.
Let's talk a little bit about budget surpluses. The states operate under a budget surplus for several years now, and I don't know what the number is right now, but I'm assuming it's still a surplus. So we'll start with you this time, Tim. If in the next session, how would you address that? What would you do with the surplus money that the state is taking in? That's
a great question, Jim. And people need to remember that the surplus number is going to look a little bit artificially inflated from what it really should be. In the federal government, Congress passed a tax reform bill that affected the tax returns in Minnesota for the year 2018. The legislature, on a bipartisan approach, sent the governor a couple of different options on that, of which he vetoed those. So Minnesota is not in compliance with the federal tax code. By that I mean there are things that you would not be able to deduct on the Minnesota return and the federal return. So there's going to be a disconnect. So people will ultimately end up paying higher taxes in 2018 as a result of some of those kinds of things, or that potential exists. Had we passed a tax conformity bill, we could have also seen some additional revenues that would have been true revenues coming in, not just the failure to non-conform on that. So that's going to be one thing that I think Minnesotans are going to keep their eye on. They're probably not thinking about it on the 14th, 15th of September, but they'll sure be thinking about it on April 15th. There's not much we can do unless the governor calls a special session now. We're getting late in the game for him to do something like that for us to be able to put tax conformity on the table. Again, we also will continue to fund Minnesota's roads and bridge projects. Stearns County just put on a tax here, a sales tax within the past year to raise money out of the St. Cloud area to be able to help with road projects in other parts of the county. And I think it's also important that we be able to provide some additional road and bridge money for folks as well.
All right. Heidi, how about you? The excess surplus money, if you will, where would it go if you were able to vote on that?
I always approach revenue, whether it be surplus or what is coming in and is expected, the same way that we approach our family bills and how we raised our kids. Is you go area of greatest need, you go rainy day fund, and then you go discretionary spending. The discretionary spending, I think, is putting money back in the hands of the taxpayers, because everyone can use $100, $500, $800, whether it be for their area of greatest need, donating to a charity, or just, keeping their head above water. And so that needs to go back to the taxpayers. Rainy day fund, we've got a lot of unforeseen circumstances that will be coming down out of Washington that we need to be prepared for. In terms of area of greatest need, again, I think we are in agreement on what some of those challenges are, particularly infrastructure. But when it comes to infrastructure right now, our current system for funding roads and bridges is like my great uncle's Art and Harold. They used to bury money in mason jars under the porch. And right now we've got pots of money, big pots of money, but pots of money from the state, from the local, from the federal, where we can take grant money to help meet some of those infrastructure needs. But we are looking at a $13 billion shortfall for roads and bridges over the next 10 years. I am not opposed to a constitutional amendment to allocate funds, but it needs to be comprehensive and it needs to be far-reaching. For example, if we say let's put gas tax money in there and increase the gas tax, if we become a fossil-free, clean energy state, then that eliminates that issue. So it does need to be forward-thinking. I think all options need to be on the table, whether it be a congestion tax or tollways, which have worked great in other communities around the country as well as internationally. If we look at dialing back asphalt and putting gravels on the road, put it on the table. And I think we need to incentivize corporations like Cargill right now, who is actually testing various road surface structures that have greater resiliency to the extreme temperature changes in Minnesota, so that you're not having to replace them as often and wonder where that money's going to come from. So discretionary spending goes back to the people, area of greatest need, rainy day fund.
All right. Since you both brought up transportation and you mentioned the constitutional amendment, there's been talk, I think, over the last few sessions about a constitutional amendment that would require revenue from the sale of auto parts, repairs to be funded for roads and bridges. If that bill comes forward again this legislative session, is that something that you could support, Tim, that would be dedicated money for transportation?
Absolutely. Minnesota's got a growing economy, and as we've been talking about with surpluses, if we were to reallocate money that came from sales tax on repairs and automobiles and the like, that seems to be a rather logical source to be able to have it be self-funding. And as Minnesota continues to grow and revenue receipts come into the Department of Revenue, those monies that have been moved over from the general fund to be dedicated can be backfilled by funds from another source. I think it's somewhat of a non-starter for people to say you're just robbing the general fund of other needs. That's not true. Minnesota's a growing economy, and as a result of that, we can provide people with the roads and bridges that they need. Representative Howe has championed that bill many times in the legislature and has championed it as a constitutional amendment. We just have not been able to get agreement between the two chambers to be able to get it on the ballot for the people to be able to vote on as a constitutional amendment.
Heidi, how about you? Would you support that bill to put that on the ballot as a constitutional amendment?
I support a constitutional amendment, but I think it needs to go beyond just the tax on auto parts sales and service.
Okay. Just so you guys know, at the State Fair poll on this question, the people that went to the State Fair, 42% said yes, they would vote for that amendment, and 39% said no. So it's very, very close. So that would be a big talking point, a big issue, I think, with voters.
Got to find those undecideds and see what's going on.
Exactly.
Absolutely. We have just a couple of minutes left. So more fun question, I guess. One issue, liquor laws tend to come up a lot at the state capitol. So should grocery stores and convenience stores be allowed to sell beer, wine, and distilled spirits? We're one of the few states that doesn't allow that. So Heidi, how about you? Is that something that you would get behind if that bill comes up again next session?
I absolutely support that. I have a cabin in Montana, and I've lived abroad where you can get beer and wine at the grocery store when you're picking up something for dinner. I see no problem with it. I think it's a convenience for Minnesotans as well as potential economic increase.
How about you, Tim?
I've been kind of ambivalent on what the liquor-related issue as far as should it be in the grocery store? Does it have to be separated out in liquor stores? I've done an awful lot of traveling in my private sector jobs that I've had across the country, and have seen different models. There's constantly conversation and discussion going on about that. But, Jim, if I could, before we leave, another extremely big priority for me next year, which we didn't get passed with the governor this year, is increased money for school safety and for mental health. And I've worked a lot with the superintendents and with education groups. I'm pleased to be able to report that I've received a lot of education endorsements this year from various administrative groups, from police and fire, and from other groups, because they're really appreciative of my no-nonsense, let's get in, get it done, and move things to the governor's desk to get them signed approach. And education will continue to be a school safety as well.
Yeah, for both of you, if my numbers are correct, so $25 million was allocated for school safety, and there were
school safety.
Yeah, and there was $250 million in requests for school safety. So clearly there's still a lot to be done in that area.
And that was just for school safety.
Yeah.
And it was a broader category. There was taking down some of the fences around money that was on there. There was $50 million approximately to replenish money that the DNR hasn't been paying. School trust lands for rent on property. There was a lot of other money that was in there. Initiatives that I've worked on ever since I stepped foot in the Minnesota House. And I thought this year would have been a really great year for us to be able to help kids that way, and help schools with social workers, counselors, and other individuals to be able to help identify those kids who are having a tough time, so we don't have those kinds of national things that have been happening right here in our own neighborhoods in Minnesota.
I'll let you weigh in on that too.
Yeah, I've got there's a couple issues with that. The first and foremost would be that we were in an unfortunate part of our society, time in our society, where we're talking about how our kids can survive the school day versus how they can thrive during the school day. And while it's great that we set aside funding in this particular bill, although it's woefully short, we do need to partner that type of funding for school safety and upgrades with common sense gun safety regulations about transfers and private sales. I met a woman, I talked to a woman a month ago who went and bought a gun. It was her very first gun, and the people at the store were really helpful picking out what was appropriate. She did the background check, did all the paperwork that she was supposed to do. They escorted her out of the store, gave her the gun to take home. She went to a birthday party and gave it to somebody. That is a loophole that needs to be fixed. When it comes to school funding and the omnibus bill that was vetoed, the way that bill was presented reminds me of my teenagers when they were texting me at curfew to say that they weren't coming home because they were tired, and then they turned off the phone and I couldn't get a hold of them the rest of the night. This bill was pushed through in the final hours of the session when there were issues in it that the legislature knew were there that the governor had challenges with. This speaks to that civility and that lack of ability to compromise and get things done. There should have been ongoing conversations leading up to that bill going out to make sure that that funding would get approved for the people who need it.
All right. We are completely out of time. Great discussion. Thank you guys for both coming in. I really appreciate it.